Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 225 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions, your one-stop shop to all things FCPA compliance related. Today I begin a two-part podcast series on a retrospective look at 2015. In today's episode, I take a look at SEC and DOJ enforcement actions, matters, and communications that came out in 2015. There was a lot of good information for the compliance practitioner, and we're going to go over that and talk about some of the enforcement actions and some of the lessons learned that you may be able to get from those. The episode comes in at around 20 minutes. I would also like to remind you that I have an upcoming FCPA Masterclass in Houston, Texas on January 21 and 22. I've got a couple of slots open, so if you'd like the best FCPA nuts and bolts training there is, please give me a shout at tfox@tfoxlaw.com, where you can check out Advanced Compliance Solutions, which will give you detailed information and registration information on the event. Thank you very much for listening. Hello again, and this is Tom Fox. So let's hop right into it by beginning with the SEC enforcement actions of 2015. We had a lot of SEC activity this year, and indeed more SEC FCPA enforcement actions than there were from the Department of Justice. We had a lot of information conveyed by the SEC through these enforcement actions. And once again, there are lessons to be learned for the compliance practitioner. SEC enforcement actions do not involve criminal conduct. They are all civil matters, and they generally revolve around violations of the accounting provisions, which of course are books and records, and internal controls. So let's jump right into it with our first case, BNY Mellon, that's Bank of New York Mellon. This was the first case that touched upon the issue of hiring of close family members. In the case of Mellon, it was two sons and a nephew of two separate foreign government officials. We should first note that the case involved employees of sovereign wealth funds. So if there was ever a question as to whether sovereign wealth funds were covered under the FCPA, that has now been answered with an emphatic yes. And employees of sovereign wealth funds will be employees of state-owned enterprises and therefore covered under the FCPA instrumentality language. So what happened in these cases, it was two situations where sovereign wealth fund employees approached Mellon about hiring two sons and a nephew. And certainly there's nothing wrong with hiring a close family member, but if you do it for a benefit, that's where you're going to get into FCPA trouble. And Mellon did not have a spreadsheet tying directly the business they received. Nevertheless, it was pretty clear from the cease and desist orders that benefits were obtained by Mellon in the form of new and or additional business, or in the parlance of the FCPA, obtaining or retaining business. What really got Mellon into trouble was that they had an established hiring protocol for their internship program, and that's where these people were hired. This protocol was not followed. These hirees did not meet the Mellon standards for hire, either educationally or professionally. They did not receive the same pay as other hirees. They did not receive the same training. They did not receive the same number of interviews. It completely stepped out of or what granted an exception to the standard hiring process. When you have an exception to any part of your process, that's where you get into trouble if you do not have a business justification. And unfortunately for Mellon, they had no business justification for doing so other than to obtain or retain business from these sovereign wealth funds. So pretty clear FCPA violation. But certainly a big case because it was the first one. The J.P. Morgan case has garnered most of the attention because of the spreadsheet I mentioned, where allegedly they tied the hiring of sons and daughters of high government officials to specific pieces of business. But the FCPA blog, for instance, has also reported that Credit Suisse, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, and UBS are all under investigation for hiring as well. Another significant case, or the next up rather, is a BHP Billiton. This was significant because it was the highest books and records, or accounting provisions, I should say, fine ever of $25 million, and it was internal controls violations. This revolved around the company's hospitality program for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Once again, there is nothing in the FCPA which prevents you from entertaining at very high-profile sporting events, such as the Olympics, the World Cup, Super Bowl, Wimbledon, you name the event. But if it's a high priority, or rather high profile, it's probably going to be high risk, and that just means you need to manage that risk. BHP Billiton started out to manage that risk by putting a protocol in place, but pretty quickly this protocol fell apart, and that's where they got into trouble. They had an internal control, but they didn't follow it. The internal control required a business justification, obviously a good start, but they didn't train the business people on how to fill it out. They ended up being cut and paste jobs, and it ended up being the business people who ended up making the decisions on who got to go to the Beijing Olympics sponsored by BHP Billiton, even though there was an Olympic sponsorship steering committee and a global ethics panel subcommittee specifically tasked with oversight of this. So we had more than a failure of oversight because we had, as I mentioned, the forms filled out, and the process ended up being cut and paste jobs. There was not training to business unit employees about making the correct calls on hospitality or hospitality for spouses. There was no guidance to senior managers about how any of this should apply. So really a complete, total, and utter failure of internal controls by BHP Billiton. But once again, the eye-popping nature of the fine, I think, got a lot of people's attention. So some very big and important lessons in this case. Next up was BristolMyers Squib. And BristolMyers Squib joined the long litany of companies that got into FCPA trouble regarding their operations in China. And specifically, this was a joint venture in China. BristolMyers Squib, or I'll just call it Bristol-Myers, they had identified gaps in internal controls in the joint venture and did not move forward to correct or remediate those gaps. These gaps were identified from 2009 to 2013, yet BristolMyers Squibb, or Bristol-Myers, failed to institute an effective internal control system and respond promptly to indications of gaps, compliance gaps, in the Chinese joint venture. The company, however, made a significant comeback, obviously because they got a civil penalty as opposed to a criminal penalty, and in the face of these deficiencies. The cease and desist order laid out many of the steps that Bristol-Myers took and the general compliance training and policies they instituted to do so. They some of the examples included a 100% pre-reimbursement review of all expense claims, an implementation of an accounting system designed to track each expense claim, including the request, the requestor, the payment, and the approval for each, retention of a third-party vendor to conduct surprise checks at events sponsored by sales representatives. There was a termination of over 90 employees and disciplining of other employees who were involved in the bribery scheme. So also there was a replacement of senior Bristol-Myers officials in China as part of an overall effort to enhance tone at the top and the compliance culture. Finally, the company revised its compensation structure and reduced the portion of incentive-based compensations for sales and distribution. So some pretty significant actions taken, and this enforcement action was very good because it laid out these factors in a way that you can use in your compliance program going forward. Once again, many of the lessons learned are available to you in these FCPA enforcement actions, and the Bristol-Myers Squibb was certainly one that stood out for giving you some solid information. It also allows you to benchmark your program about the current best practices. Next up was Hitachi, and this was very interesting for several reasons. First of all, it was a Japanese company, and they had FCPA jurisdiction laid upon them because they had something called American Depository Shares, which were listed in the New York Stock Exchange, listed and traded. So there was clearly FCPA jurisdiction. Hitachi got into trouble in South Africa. And in South Africa, there is a specific program which encourages non-South African company investment in minority-owned enterprises. And the company did so, but while in the pendency of this relationship, the members of the minority-owned enterprise either became or actually were members of the African National Congress, which is the political party currently ruling South Africa. And for those of you not aware, a foreign government official is also a member or political party. A member of a political party is also a foreign government official as defined by the FCPA. So it turned out that the payments that were made to the South African minority partner were classified as illegal under the FCPA because the people who it went to were part of the governing party. So very interesting that we have political parties, not usual in FCPA action, but it pointed up the need for continued due diligence during the pendency of your relationship, and indeed, if a minority, or rather a joint venture partner or other business relation becomes a person subject to the FCPA, either through their involvement with the government, a state-owned enterprise, or even a political party, that's something that you need to put in your contract that they need to notify you of, and you need to do additional and enhanced due diligence going forward. So pretty interesting case for involving Hitachi. Also, there were some African entities that were involved in the investigation, the African Development Bank and the South African Financial Services Board, who were specifically singled out as providing assistance to the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's we have not seen those entities involved in providing information to the DOJ or SEC before. Next up is Meade Johnson. And Meade Johnson really speaks to the need of a robust internal investigation. Obviously, one of the key things that happened last year was the Yates memo, and which pointed directly to your internal investigation. But Meade Johnson was a case where the company began an internal investigation and did not find any evidence of violations of the FCPA. And later, the Securities and Exchange Commission found out about these through whistleblower action or other mechanisms. So it really points directly to the quality of your investigation and what you need to do going forward. It was an important case for this reason, and the last thing you want to be in a position is a government regulator knowing that you've engaged, or at least suspecting that you've engaged in an FCPA violation, and you not being aware of it. Meade Johnson got into trouble in China, so it once again speaks to the high-risk nature of doing business in China, and if you're doing business there, you need to take a look at that as closely as you can going forward. So now let's turn to the Department of Justice. Now, there were very few corporate FCPA enforcement actions in 2015. Very down year, or low number year, I should say. There were certainly a couple. The IIP Worldwide Services case, which came out in the spring, and there was a second case involving Louis Berger International, I believe in September. Both relatively low dollar fines, and the conduct which occurred was certainly significant, raised enough to create criminal liability. In both cases, individuals pled guilty to FCPA violations. From IEP Worldwide, Vice President James Rama pled guilty to FCPA violations, and from Louis Berger International, we had a couple of former executives, Richard Hirsch and James McClung. So the DOJ is clearly communicating that they have and will go after individuals. Further to that point was the sentencing of several former managers, directors, officers, and employees of DAP Partners. This was a case from 2013 involving the bribery of a foreign official, a representative of the Venezuelan National Bank, Bandes. And the sentencing was laid off for a couple of years. So we saw some pretty hefty sentences granted, certainly not in the range of the Escanabi sentencing and Rodriguez. Nevertheless, a gentleman pled guilty, and several pled guilty, and they received their sentences for this. So we had former Chief Executive Officer Benito China, former Managing Partner Ernesto Lujan, former Regional Director, former broker Jose Alejandro, all pled guilty to violations all around the DAP Partners case. We also had in December the sentencing of Vicente Garcia, former Regional Director of Enterprise Software for SAP, who was sentenced to 22 months for his individual crimes violating the FCPA. We had a really interesting comment in the DOJ press release, which said that under questioning, Garcia admitted that he believed paying such bribes were necessary to secure both initial contracts and additional payments, additional Panamanian government contracts for the sale of SAP software products to the government of Panama. SAP has not received any final resolution against them, so we'll have to see how that one goes. We couldn't talk about 2015 without mentioning the Joseph Siegelman case. Siegelman was a former co-CEO at PetroTiger. PetroTiger was a company involved with in Colombia, and they engaged in bribery and corruption. Mr. Siegelman chose to go to trial when his former general counsel and former co-CEO both pled guilty to FCPA violations. Mr. Siegelman's trial was, I don't think you can call it really anything but a disaster, when the former general counsel pretty much folded on the witness stand, and the DOJ offered a low or a settlement to Mr. Siegelman, I should say. He pled guilty to the violation of the FCPA and received probation. Both the former general counsel and his co-CEO also received the same penalties. But Mr. Siegelman did plead guilty, and I think that's important that the naysayers who point to this as some disastrous example of DOJ prosecutions gone wrong and certainly off the rails seem to conveniently forget that he pled guilty. And he pled guilty to conspiracy to violate the FCPA. So trial was clearly not in the DOJ's favor. Nevertheless, they got a guilty verdict out of it, or guilty plea rather, and moved on down the road. For the DOJ, though, the really interesting things were the Yates Memo and the new Compliance Council. The Yates Memo came out in early September, and this was a memo which indicated the new calculus for receipt of cooperation credit from the DOJ would be turning over individuals culpable of FCPA violations, although it was released in the context of all white-collar crime, not simply the FCPA. But it made the threshold now for any cooperation credit, and let me say that in the memo itself, the word any was double underscored bold, so pretty clear that you have to turn over individuals now to move to the second step, which is credit under your compliance program. So we haven't seen really any prosecutions under this new memo as yet, and we'll have to see how that plays out. Also, we had the new Compliance Counsel named Wei Chin. She's a former DOJer who went into private practice, significant experience in the corporate world, and she's going to help evaluate compliance programs of companies that are under scrutiny in the because of a self-disclosure to the Department of Justice. In November, Assistant Attorney General Leslie Caldwell laid out some factors that the Compliance Council would use in evaluating her or company's compliance program. So they were along the lines of the following. Does the institution ensure its directors and senior managers will provide strong, explicit, and visible support for compliance programs and policies? Do the people responsible for compliance have stature within the organization, and do they get adequate funding? Are the institution's compliance policies clear and in writing? Are they understood by employees? Are they translated into local languages? Is there training and evaluation of the training on these policies and procedures? Does the institution or the company review regularly its policies and procedures and keep them up to date with evolving risks and circumstances? Are there mechanisms in place to enforce the compliance programs, the carrot and the stick? This includes incentivizing good compliance and disciplining violations. Is the discipline delivered in an even-handed manner? And how about your third parties? Do you train your third parties about expectations? It means more than simply the boilerplate language in a contract or some sort of comment that or certification that they have not violated the FCPA over the past year. So very interesting information from the Department of Justice. Of course, we had the FIFA corruption scandal, not an FCPA case, but the first time we'd seen the Department of Justice go after a major sporting entity, international sporting entity, using the RICO statutes. And the Volkswagen case, we're going to have to see how that plays out. So that's sort of my take on FCPA enforcement from 2015. Once again, if you have any questions or you'd like any follow-up, you can give me a shout at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox, and thank you very much for listening.